In the hills of southeastern Turkey, buried under 12,000 years of soil and silence, there is a stone that should not exist. It stands taller than 3 men. It weighs as much as 10 cars. Its surface was ground so smooth, its edges cut so cleanly, that when you trace the seam where 2 faces meet, you find yourself reaching for a word that does not belong in the Stone Age. The word is precision. And the people who supposedly carved this stone had no metal, no wheel, no writing, no agriculture. They were hunters. They followed herds. They chipped flint into blades and slept under open skies. And yet, on a modest limestone ridge the locals call Göbekli Tepe, the hill of the navel, they left behind something that engineers today, with cranes and diamond saws and laser levels, still struggle to fully explain. For most of the 20th century, almost no one knew it was there. It sat beneath a low, rounded hill, unremarkable, planted with sparse trees and grazed by goats. A survey team in the 1960s noted broken limestone slabs poking through the dirt and dismissed the site as a medieval graveyard, not worth a second look. The most important archaeological site on Earth was written off in a footnote and left alone for 30 more years. To understand what changed, you have to go back to a summer afternoon in 1994. A Kurdish shepherd was moving his flock across the dry ridge near the city of Şanlıurfa in Turkey's far southeast, close to the Syrian border. The ground there is pale and cracked in the heat, scattered with limestone rubble. As he walked, something caught his eye. A stone half buried, but too regular. Its top edge was flat, too flat. Nature does not carve corners into buried rock like that. Word reached the local museum, and eventually a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt heard the description and could not let it go. He had spent years studying the prehistory of the region, and he knew the difference between a worked stone and a natural one. When he finally climbed the hill and saw the shapes emerging from the dirt, he realized the earlier survey had been catastrophically wrong. This was not a medieval cemetery. It was something far older. He began systematic excavation in 1995, and that dig would consume the rest of his life. He spent the next 2 decades on that ridge and died in 2014 still trying to understand what he had uncovered. What emerged, layer by careful layer, was a complex of stone circles. Not 1, not 2, but at least 20, ringed one inside another, with geophysical surveys suggesting many more still waiting beneath the surface. Each circle was built from precisely carved limestone monoliths, and at the center of each stood 2 towering pillars, the largest reaching roughly 18 feet in height and weighing an estimated 10 to 15 tons, with some structural elements at the site, estimated even heavier. These were not rough boulders stood on end. They were shaped into a distinctive T-form, wider at the top, as though the crossbar were a head resting on a body and placed deliberately at the highest point of the ridge, visible for miles across the plain. Then came the radiocarbon dates, and this is where the story stopped being merely interesting and became genuinely destabilizing. The oldest layers of Göbekli Tepe date to roughly 9600 BCE, meaning construction began close to 11,600 years ago. Sit with that number, because it's easy to say and hard to feel. That is around 6,000 years before Stonehenge, and roughly 7,000 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza. When these pillars were raised, the last ice age had barely loosened its grip on the planet. According to the standard model of human development, the people living in this region at the time were small, mobile bands of hunter-gatherers, using technology that had barely changed in tens of thousands of years. Those are the people credited with building this. The carvings only sharpen the puzzle. Across the surfaces of these pillars, in shallow relief and confident deep line, are foxes with mouths open, lions mid-stride, vultures with wings spread, scorpions with tails curled, snakes bundled in flowing rows, wild boar, cranes, and abstract geometric marks that repeat from pillar to pillar and circle to circle. On the central pillars, if you look closely, you find something that changes how you read the whole site. Stylized arms, bent at the elbow, ending in long carved hands that reach around to the front of the stone, beneath the suggestion of a belt or a garment. These T-shaped pillars are not decoration. They are stylized figures, faceless, immense, arms folded, standing at the center of every enclosure as if watching. The question that has haunted the site since Schmidt first understood it is the simplest one, and still the least resolved. Who were these people, and how did they do this? The mainstream explanation deserves to be stated in its strongest, fairest form, because it is not a lazy theory. Around 9600 BCE, the story goes, hunter-gatherer bands living in the fertile arc of southeastern Anatolia began gathering seasonally at this ridge, likely drawn by shared ritual and feasting, evidenced by huge quantities of animal bone found on site. They quarried limestone from bedrock shelves nearby using stone and antler tools, shaped the great T-pillars by pecking away at the rock with hammerstones over weeks and months, dragged the finished monoliths on ropes and wooden sledges, and levered them upright into sockets cut into the bedrock floor. They carved the animals, arranged the rings, and then, at some point after roughly 8000 BCE, for reasons still debated, they deliberately backfilled the enclosures with rubble, broken stone, animal bone, and soil, burying the pillars under an artificial mound where they remained sealed for 10,000 years. In this reading, Göbekli Tepe is one of the earliest known monumental ritual sites, possibly predating settled agriculture in the region, which has led many archaeologists to argue that the impulse to gather and build communally may have helped drive the shift toward farming and permanent settlement, rather than the other way around. It is, in this telling, a shrine that came before the town. It's a compelling story, and it's the one taught in most textbooks, largely because it fits comfortably inside what we're prepared to believe about hunter-gatherers. But there is a problem, and it is not a footnote-sized one. It sits at the center of the claim and gets more uncomfortable the closer you examine it. Start with sheer physical reality. Some of the pillars at Göbekli Tepe are estimated to weigh in the range of 10 to 20 tons, and in the unfinished quarries nearby, archaeologists have found abandoned pillars still partly attached to the bedrock, including one estimate placing an unfinished monolith at around 50 tons if it had ever been freed. Someone was preparing to move something on that scale. Now weigh that against what the builders are supposed to have had available. No metal of any kind, since metallurgy would not appear in the region for thousands of years. No wheel, which doesn't show up in the archaeological record until roughly 6,000 years later. No domesticated draft animals, no writing to record a plan, no known engineering tradition passed down from earlier monuments, because as far as the record shows, there weren't any. Göbekli Tepe doesn't sit at the end of a long developmental sequence. It appears close to fully formed, out of a world that, according to everything else we've dug up, had built nothing remotely like it before. Modern engineers don't wave this problem away. Moving multi-ton monoliths is a serious operation even today, with hydraulic cranes and rated steel cable. Experimental archaeologists attempting to replicate ancient methods, using teams of people, wooden rollers, fiber rope, and earthen ramps, have managed to move stones of a few tons across flat ground with enormous coordinated effort. Scaling that to the larger pillars at Göbekli Tepe, up a ridge, and then standing them upright with the alignment the site shows, is a considerably harder problem, and honestly, archaeologists still argue over exactly how it was done. Then there's the finish. Run your eyes, or as the excavators describe it, your hand across a well-preserved pillar, and you find flatness that a purely hand-pecked stone shouldn't easily produce. True, level faces meeting at clean edges and deliberate angles. The reliefs are cut with a consistency that suggests a hand that knew exactly where the line was going before it started, not the tentative first attempt of a people inventing stone carving from scratch, which raises an uncomfortable question the standard story doesn't fully answer. If this is the beginning, where is the clumsy early version? Where's the fumbling apprenticeship that should precede this kind of mastery? Some researchers who have studied the sequencing of enclosures have noted that the earlier structures don't look obviously cruder than the later ones, and in some cases appear more elaborate, which sits awkwardly with a simple story of steadily improving technique. For decades, this anomaly sat there, acknowledged by specialists in careful, hedged language, and then set aside, because answering it properly would require holding archaeology, astronomy, geology, climate science, and linguistics in your head simultaneously, cross-referencing 30 years of scans, surveys, and carvings without losing a single thread, and without a career writing on which answer turned out to be true. That's an almost impossible ask for any one person. It's exactly the kind of cross-disciplinary pattern matching that large AI systems are now being tested on. And in recent years, researchers have started feeding site data, laser scans, radar surveys, carving catalogs, into machine learning systems, partly to see whether a system with no institutional stake in the outcome would notice something specialists, each looking through their own narrow lens, might miss. So try this thought experiment because it's a genuinely useful way to think about the site, even though no verified published AI analysis of this kind has been conducted using Grok or any other system, and none of what follows should be treated as an established finding. Imagine handing an AI everything humanity has recorded about this ridge. Every laser scan of every pillar, every ground-penetrating radar sweep, every measured angle, every catalog symbol, every soil sample, every published paper with no hypothesis attached, and simply asking it to report what it sees. The first place any honest analysis would look is the carvings. For decades, the foxes and vultures and scorpions and snakes have been described as symbolic art, the imagery of a belief system we've lost access to. Beautiful, mysterious, but treated as essentially decorative. A pattern recognition system, though, wouldn't just describe the imagery. It would count it. It would catalog every carved mark across every pillar and enclosure and measure distribution, frequency, position, the things human eyes are genuinely bad at, tracking across dozens of stones at once. And here's where real published research already gets interesting without any need for invented statistics. Researchers cataloging the symbols at Göbekli Tepe have identified dozens of distinct recurring motifs, and some do cluster by enclosure in ways that have led a handful of scholars to argue for a shared symbolic or proto-notational system across the site, something more structured than pure decoration, though this remains a minority, actively contested interpretation, not a settled conclusion. If it holds up, it would push organized symbolic communication back thousands of years earlier than the cuneiform tablets of Mesopotamia, which are usually credited as the earliest form of writing, dating to around 3400 BCE, roughly 6,000 years after Gobekli Tepe's oldest layers. The far more famous and far more contested piece of this puzzle is a single carved slab known as Pillar 43, sometimes called the Vulture Stone, found in Enclosure D. It shows a vulture with an outstretched wing, a prominent disc balanced near its wingtip, a scorpion, a headless human-like figure, and several other animal forms. Archaeologists have argued over its meaning for years without reaching consensus. In 2017, engineering researcher Martin Sweatman and colleague Dimitrios Tsikritsis published a paper proposing that the animal figures on Pillar 43 don't represent gods or totems at all, but constellations, and that read as a star map, the stone appears to record a date close to 10,950 BCE, strikingly close to the onset of a real, well-documented period of abrupt climate change called the Younger Dryas. The Younger Dryas itself is not speculation. It's one of the most studied climate events in the Pleistocene record. Around 12,900 years ago, after several thousand years of warming as the last ice age was ending, the northern hemisphere plunged abruptly back into near-glacial cold, with some ice core records suggesting temperature drops of several degrees within a matter of decades. An extraordinarily fast shift by geological standards. What caused it is still genuinely debated among scientists. The traditional explanation involves a massive pulse of glacial meltwater disrupting ocean circulation in the North Atlantic. But a competing and increasingly discussed idea, known as the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, argues that a fragmented comet or swarm of extraterrestrial debris struck or exploded over the northern hemisphere, triggering wildfires, a dust veil that blocked sunlight, and the sudden cooling that followed. Evidence cited for this includes layers of unusual materials found at sites across multiple continents dated to this window, including elevated platinum concentrations, melt glass, and nanodiamonds, though many geologists and impact specialists remain skeptical, arguing these signatures can be explained by other processes, and that the hypothesis, while intriguing, has not been confirmed to the standard required to overturn the mainstream meltwater pulse explanation. Sweatman's proposal was that Pillar 43 encodes the date of exactly this kind of catastrophic sky event, essentially functioning as an ancient record of a comet strike, with the disk symbol representing the object itself rather than the sun. The idea was met, predictably, with sharp skepticism from much of the archaeological community, who argue that reading specific constellations into Paleolithic animal carvings risks projecting modern star charts onto imagery that may have had entirely different non-astronomical meanings to the people who carved it. It remains to this day a live, unresolved argument between a small number of researchers who find the astronomical correlation compelling and a larger mainstream that considers it an intriguing but unproven pattern match. Still, if you sit with the possibility, even as an open question rather than a proven fact, it reframes the entire site in an unsettling way. If a culture on this ridge really was tracking celestial events precisely enough to record a specific one, that implies sustained, careful skywatching, passed down with enough consistency to encode it in stone by people the conventional model describes as small mobile hunting bands with no permanent settlements and no writing. And there's a second layer to the puzzle that isn't contested at all, the burial itself. For years, the fact that Göbekli Tepe's enclosures were deliberately backfilled with rubble, soil, and animal bone was treated as a curiosity, maybe abandonment, maybe a ritual closing. But the fill wasn't random debris dumped haphazardly. Excavators have noted that the backfilling appears to have been done with some care, and whatever the intent, the practical effect was that the carved faces of the pillars were protected from millennia of weathering, erosion, and looting, which is a significant part of why the reliefs we see today are so remarkably crisp for their age. Whether that preservation was the deliberate goal or simply a fortunate side effect of a ritual closing practice is, again, genuinely unresolved. What is not in dispute is that Göbekli Tepe is not alone. Archaeologists have identified a cluster of related sites in the same region of southeastern Turkey, including Karahan Tepe, Nevelachori, and several others, sharing similar T-shaped pillars, comparable dates, and overlapping symbolic motifs. This has led to a broader reassessment of the entire pre-pottery Neolithic period in the region, suggesting a network of ritual centers built and maintained by interconnected communities over a span of well over 1,000 years, which is itself a staggering claim about social organization, coordination, and shared cultural memory among people conventionally described as pre-agricultural. Sustaining a shared architectural and symbolic tradition across multiple sites for that long implies something closer to an organized regional culture than scattered, disconnected bands who happen to build similar things independently. So where does that leave us? Not with a confirmed AI-cracked code, and not with a certified date for a comet strike, because those specific claims remain speculative, and in the exact form some viral content presents them, unverified or outright invented. But it does leave us with something genuinely strange and well-documented. A monumental complex built roughly 11,600 years ago by people the textbooks say shouldn't have had the organization, tools, or motive to build it, carved with a level of finish that looks less like a first attempt and more like inherited mastery, sitting atop or near carvings that a real, published, peer-reviewed paper has argued encode the date of one of the most significant climate catastrophes in human prehistory, an argument the mainstream still hasn't resolved either way. Klaus Schmidt himself, before his death in 2014, remarked that Göbekli Tepe forced archaeologists to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the transition from hunting and gathering to settled life, suggesting the desire to gather for shared belief and ritual may have come before and helped drive the shift to agriculture rather than farming coming first and religion following. That alone was already a quiet revolution in how we think about the dawn of civilization. Whether or not a machine, artificial or otherwise, ever definitively cracks what's carved into that hillside, the honest state of the evidence right now is this. We know almost nothing for certain about who these builders really were, what they believed, or why they buried what they built. We know the dates, we know the weights, we know the skill in the stone, and we know that every year, new excavation at Gobekli Tepe and its sister sites chips away a little more at the version of prehistory most of us were taught in school. Less than 5% of the site has reportedly been excavated so far, which means whatever answer eventually emerges, if it ever fully does, is almost certainly still buried under that ridge, waiting. So here's the honest question worth sitting with, without pretending an AI has already solved it for us. What does it tell us about the deep past if the oldest monumental structure we've ever found was built not by a struggling first civilization, slowly learning to build, but by people who already seem to have known exactly what they were doing? And what else, buried under hills we've dismissed as unremarkable, is still waiting for someone, human or otherwise, to finally look closely enough to see it?